Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network's BRN Sunday podcast, where members of the media, academia, and financial services discuss all the latest news in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more. I'm Jeff Snyder, your host. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of BRN Sunday. Well, let's start things off with a look at the latest technology trends. And joining me on the line, Dan Klein, Senior Technology and Consumer Products Reporter with The Motley Fool. Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. It's been a great week here. Are you recovered from your recent trip, recent cruise?
I am. It's been a gray week here based on the constant rain, and it's still warm, but it's not as tropical as I had a week ago.
Yeah, well, you know what? You'll have another trip up in the next month, so something to look forward to. And you guys are very privileged in West Palm in Florida. You guys get pretty decent weather a lot of the time, so you'll have to grin and bear it. But let's. I know you want to talk about some ad blocking on mobile phones. What can you tell us there?
Yeah, so the number of people using ad blocking on mobile phones has risen dramatically. And as a publisher, as a writer, this is something that sort of bothers me. On the other hand, as a consumer, I can see why. So let's look at it from the consumer point of view. Ads used to be, at the top of the page, there'd be an ad, maybe somewhere in line there would be an ad. It didn't really impact your ability to read the story. And that meant that the effectiveness of the ad depended on whether the ad was any good. Are they advertising something I want? Is it clever? Is it a promotion I want to sign up for? I'm sure you've been to apps or websites on your phone
Hmm.
where the advertising makes the experience unbearable. Um, there's pop-ups. You can't see your thing. You have to click out of stuff. You can't figure out how to get to the story. And that type of thing obviously is a bad consumer experience. So when that happens, consumers turn to ad blocking. And what that does is that eliminates all the ads, but it also eliminates the revenue that helps produce future stories.
Yeah.
So publishers are in a very strange position where they've kind of done this to themselves. Like, create a bad impression to get as much money as you can, and people are going to use this software. The problem is, if you fix it, people might still say, hey, I'm going to use this software. I don't want to see any ads. We see it in television. People use a DVR so they could fast forward through commercials. And in many ways, that invalidates the sort of implied contract for free television. Like, you watch the show, you watch the ads. Like, that's kind of how it works. So this is actually potentially a real crisis where journalism has to be paid for somehow, and advertising has traditionally been that model. Obviously, there are other models. I work for the Motley Fool, which is a subscription-driven model. But in most cases, if there are no ads, there are no writers being paid. And so, yes, they pushed it too far on the publisher side. On the other hand, consumers are kind of breaking a covenant by skipping the ads.
Dan, as a content provider and as a growing television network and podcast network, I can kind of really relate to this because we want to be very strategic and smart about how we do it because we don't want to turn people off, as you were alluding to. And that's important. And I also realize, look, content is not free. To create the content that the Motley Fool creates or the Washington Post creates, or we created the Broadcast Retirement Network, that takes dollars, and people need to be compensated. But there is there is a level that the public will, I guess, there's a threshold, right? And if you exceed that threshold, people will just turn you off completely. And so I have no problem with seeing ads. What I hate, and when you look on some of these websites that are not the major media outlets, and you get a pop-up every 3 seconds, that is so annoying. I just disconnect. But I think people out there who are consuming the great articles that people are writing, the content that people are creating, they understand that that is not free and that has to be paid for.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this can be fixed on the publisher side, where you have to not, turn your advertising over to someone else and let it be a cash grab. It has to be, okay, I am reading an article on retirement savings, and the advertisement in that article is a value add. That might be an affiliate link that takes me to a product I might be interested in. That might be advertising that's related to the article. and everything needs to be more directed. And the problem is, we do get a lot of directed advertising. But and I think I've told this story on the air before, but I bought couches a few months ago. And so for a few months, I was looking up couches. I was searching every website. What does it cost here? What does it cost there? And then I bought the couches. And for like 6 months after, all I got was ads for couches. And of course, if you buy a couch or a car or a television, the chances that you're in the market for another one anytime quickly are very small. So the ads were targeted, but in a way that didn't benefit me. And there's no simple opt out. There's no way to say that purchase is over, start showing me something else, other than I guess you could start doing new searches and maybe you could change the algorithm there. But there's a lot of work to be done here to make advertising valuable. If you're thinking, boy, I'm thirsty, and a commercial comes on for, I don't know, the new Red Bull No Sugar, and you go, ooh, that would be great. You go to the store and buy a Red Bull. That was valuable for everybody. But a lot of advertising doesn't do that.
Yeah, and I think it's an evolution, Dan. I mean, we saw the creation of the internet, people going to the internet to get their content. We've seen a kind of an, I don't know, overreach is not the right word, but this swing where you've got all these ads. It has really diluted the media companies. I mean, these big media outlets are laying reporters off, right? I mean, they're and also on the flip side, some of these digital only places are not surviving either. So I think there's a balance here, and I think you're right. I think it's just about evolution, not revolution, when it comes to the digital model and trying to make things work. And we've talked about, I think, Apple News. That has not been a very successful aggregation product, right? I mean, that is a service that has not really
Yeah, I mean,
found its
the
mark.
problem is, so everyone has struggled with aggregation,
Yeah,
and everyone has struggled, for the most part, with paywalls. So, there's a few successes with paywalls. You could argue New York Times, Boston Globe, a couple of
yeah.
companies
The
are
big
doing
names,
well.
the big names.
Yeah, but the problem is, so I pay for a handful of them: Wall Street Journal, New York Times, but one or two others because it's relevant to my job. Uh, Now the problem with that is everyone is a separate login. You have to remember that
Yeah,
login. Maybe it's in your system, maybe it isn't. I would absolutely pay for a cable-like subscription of, you pick your flavor. In my case, it would be financial news, where I could get this stuff, where the Times and the Washington Post are ESPN. They're getting the big money out of my 9.99. They're getting $6 of it. But the tiny little guy who I read a few stories a month on, well, maybe he's getting 20 cents, and a lot of 20 cents is add up. No one has done that well. We've talked about that. It's a problem in the streaming space too. How many services are you going to join with separate logins where you can't scroll between the content between these different providers? It becomes very tricky. So we have a system that doesn't really work. And I look at the aggregators, like the true aggregators are like, MSN, and MSN is a full partner. But if you go to their money app, they have content from 100 different amazing providers and editors who are curating, and I used to do that job, making decisions about what you should see across a very broad area of stuff that reflects a lot of different viewpoints. And that's free. So, and the publishers are being paid. I don't know what everybody's deal is, but I know what some of the deals look like when I was there. So the publishers get paid for that content on different levels, and it's a sustainable system. You need to see more of that.
yeah, yeah. I agree. And more to come on that. I think this is an evolving business and will continue to evolve. But we need to get reporters. We need to incentivize reporters to write. We need them to be paid because without them, I mean, how would you consume your news? Dan, I want to shift gears in the remaining time in our segment about a new Viacom CBS streaming service that you were telling me about offline.
Yeah, so this is a weird one. So one of the early streaming services was CBS All Access.
Yep.
And CBS All Access is sort of like CBS on steroids. If you're an old person who watches CBS, because I think that's mostly their audience, you could get all of their shows, most of which appear to star Mark Harmon, and you could get a handful of originals. There's The
Yeah.
Good Fight. There was the Twilight Zone reboot that I don't
Uh,
think worked very well.
no.
There's now the new Picard show, a spinoff in the Star Trek universe. There's another Star Trek show, and it was at $4.99. It was sort of a low price. You want CBS, maybe you cut the cord, but it's important to you to watch some of those shows. It was kind of a very niche product. But of course, CBS and Viacom have combined. and Viacom owns all sorts of cable channels. So the idea is they're going to mash up their services and give you a bigger channel. And they haven't said what that's going to look like. And to me, we don't need a fifth tier service. So what I would like to see is add a bunch of stuff to CBS All Access from the rest of the Viacom Paramount family, and then don't raise the price. Keep it at $4.99 and see if you can be a real player by being kind of the value in this space. That's probably not what's going to happen. They're probably going to come out at $8.99 or $9.99 and try to package this group of assets together. And frankly, I don't see it working.
Yeah, do we need another streaming service, Dan? I mean,
Well,
we've got Disney, Hulu, Netflix. I mean, geez, Amazon Prime. How many? And by the way, I want to get your feedback on Picard if you've seen it. I want to get your feedback on that because I'm a big Trekkie.
so
Um,
I haven't seen it, and I'm a Star Wars geek. So
you
no, so
you can't be
here's the
both. You can't be both.
no, I don't think you can be both.
Well, I think I'm both. Anyway, go ahead. I took you completely off message.
So Viacom owns Comedy Central, Paramount Network, BET, MTV, all sorts of stuff. And there might be shows on those things that I want to watch. Like maybe if I cut the cord, I'd want to see The Daily Show. But the problem is, it's not better than Disney Plus. It's not better than Netflix. It's not better than Hulu. It's probably not better than HBO Max. So how deep am I going to go? And at some point, am I looking at it going, wait a minute, I'm also paying for Sling TV. If I get this CBS thing, I'm going to be spending more than I did for cable. So maybe I should just cut the cut of the cut cord, too many cuts there, and go back to cable and maybe just have cable plus Netflix. But at some point, you're paying way more for less.
Yeah,
And that doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm sure there'll be some show on this Viacom network, the equivalent of a Picard, where people who wouldn't consider getting it under any circumstances go, "Oh no, they're doing a Mission Impossible series. Like I have to watch that." But people I think are going to get more clever. There's going to be a lot more like, all right, I want to watch Picard. So I'm getting 1 month of CBS All Access at the point all those shows are released. I'm going to watch them in a week. I'm going to watch anything else that's on the service. Maybe I'll time it to a sporting event being on that I want to watch when I'm traveling or something like that. But I think you're going to see people going in and out of these second tier services much more frequently. And churn is something that's generally reported, so you might start to see an increase in churn numbers.
yeah. And I was going to say to you, that's not a good thing if you're buying if you're planning a streaming service and you're doing it subscriber based, right? I mean, you don't want to have people churn and burn your service and drop in and drop out. And you gave me an idea that I hadn't thought about because, as I mentioned to you, I don't really watch too much content, but I would never sign up for all these different services. It just seems outrageous to me to pay all that because I'd be sitting in front of my TV constantly. I don't want to do that, Dan.
Yeah, and I'll give the example. So I paid for DC Universe, and I subscribed well before it launched. So I think it was a year for like 49 or 59.99 because they had some DC Comics content that I watch and sometimes pay for. So the Batman animated movies, a couple of series, Young Justice, Titans, and I'm a sucker for superhero stuff. And the reality is, there's so much television out there that I barely use this service that I've paid for a year, not because I don't still want to watch those shows, but because there's shows that are more easily accessible to me, or maybe shows that I'm watching with my wife, and that's where my television time goes. Because you're right, we're not 14 years old watching 5 hours of TV a night. I know I watch somewhere between 1 and 2 hours of TV, usually in the later part of the night when
Hmm.
I'm done with my day. So somewhere like 8:30 to 10:30 is my television window, and that could be later, that could be smaller. So that limits what I watch, and I know I won't renew DC Universe, even though there's stuff on there I want to watch. What I will probably do is make sure I watch the things I most want to see, and then I'll just go back to it later. And we're not even talking about all of the free stuff. Like I've been catching up on Batwoman on the CW free service, which makes you see the commercials. But I'll watch the commercials in exchange for free access to a show I forgot to DVR.
Dan, let me ask you a question. We got about a minute left in the segment. Podcasts. Do you listen to podcasts? I just want to get an idea of a guy like you. You are a consumer of content. What's your podcast listening? Because you can't, how do you fill up your day watching content, creating content, because you're doing that too, and then listening to podcasts? Do you listen to them?
Yeah, so when I'm in the car, which it tends to be for long periods, I live in walking distance of most things, but we have a house near Disney, which is about 3 hours away with stops. So that's when I catch up on Bill Simmons. I'm a big Boston sports fan guy, so
Mm.
he's sort of a hero. That's when I listen to the Motley Fool podcast that I'm not on. Well, it's an interesting one because I listen into the subject matter I don't cover.
Yeah.
Because while we have wonderful analysts on market foolery and industry focus that might cover some of the things I cover, if I hear your opinion on what Target is doing, it's pretty easy for that to sort of mix in with my opinion. And you don't want to do that. It's the reason comedians, don't watch similar comedians tell jokes. It's too easy to make that joke your own. So I'm much more likely to listen to Market Foolery, hosted by the wonderful Chris Hill, if they're talking about healthcare or marijuana stocks, because those aren't things I'm capable of talking about. I listen to a lot of sports. I listen to, sometimes just recommendations of friends, comedians, like people I don't listen to all the time. But if they have a guest on, like so someone like Mark Maron, I don't love his podcasting style, but he interviewed my favorite musician a few months ago. So of course I had to listen to it. So yeah, I'm a big consumer of podcasts.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of people out there who are consuming all this media. I don't know how they're going to sort through it all. I think that's the biggest issue from my perspective. Dan Klein, always a pleasure talking with you and looking forward to having you back on the television network for your perspective on for our Tech Tuesday. So have a great rest of the weekend, and we will talk to you then. Welcome back. Let's shift gears. We're going to talk to Devin Banerjee. He's Senior Financial Services Editor for LinkedIn. Hi, Devin. How are you?
I'm doing great, Jeff. I'm coming to you from very humid and sunny Grand Cayman this time.
And what's going on there, Devin? I'm very pleased that you're in some nice weather, but what conference are you attending?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the annual Cayman Alternative Investment Summit. It's been going on for about 6 or 7 years. I decided to see what it's all about. And it's a big group of alternative investment managers, some institutional investors and asset owners, also some traditional investment managers. And there are a couple of things to report from here. One is that there's so much talk, and I find this at all the conferences I'm going to these days, that ESG is really transitioning from hype and talk into action and demands in many cases. And so a lot of institutional investors here sharing on stage and in interviews with me and others that they're really putting pressure on their investment managers to monitor ESG data, to report it back to them. There's a lot more work being done on standardizing ESG data so that comparisons are more robust, because right now a lot of companies and investment firms, collect and report ESG data in different ways. And so I think this is really, a couple of years ago when a lot of people in investing started talking about this, it was very unclear, as it always is, whether it was talk or hype. But I think I'm really seeing a lot of action coming out of these gatherings, and it's also being shown in the data. I think there's some data from BlackRock about a month ago and JP Morgan about 2 weeks ago about fund flows into ESG funds, and the numbers are just showing that is where money is flowing, whereas in other active equity funds, at least, money has been flowing out.
No, well, that's certainly an interesting trend, and trend obviously that we've talked about and we're following here in the retirement space. One area that I am very interested in is due diligence, and we've talked about that numerous times. So very interested to hear perspectives about how you do that due diligence to make sure that someone is doing what they I mean, the reporting obviously is important, but from a consulting perspective, so you're an investment consultant, you're vetting different investment opportunities for a client. How do you figure out whether someone's actually doing what they're doing and how they're doing their screens? I think that's very interesting topic to me and probably to many out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And standardizing that data is going to be very important. Also, a lot of people are interested in kind of performance attribution. So if you're looking at returns of a fund or a firm, and you want to, a lot of institutional investors want to know what component of these returns or how much of these returns are attributable to an ESG strategy and stuff like that. So there's a lot of kind of explaining going on. There's a lot of data being integrated by firms in the investment process, just as you mentioned, in screens and positive screens and negative screens. A lot of portfolio managers are having to become comfortable with ESG data, integrating it into their algorithms if it's a more quantitative firm, or just integrating it into their qualitative factors as well. So, but all of that is starting to happen, and I think the industry was kind of waiting for demands to begin. If your LPs or the people allocating money to you start demanding this stuff, and you're thinking about your next fundraise in 2 years or 5 years, you kind of know that you need to keep them happy, of course. And it's not just returns anymore; it's meaningful returns, impactful returns.
And are you getting the sense, just listening to people or talking to people, and actually doing the interviews? I want to hear about that as well. Are you getting the sense that there's definitely interest among institutional investors more so than retail investors? Because, in retirement plans, we do have some ESG-like funds, but it's never really taken off, and maybe that will change. But is it your sense that it's mostly family offices, high net worth, endowments, foundations, pension funds?
Yeah, I think that's where the interest really started, at least, and also where it's most powerful because those checks are so large. So yeah, this interest really started, as you know, Jeff, actually in Europe and the Nordic countries, and those asset owners like sovereign wealth funds and big family offices in Europe and the Nordic region, and then it came around to Australia and even Canada, and really all those places before it has come to the U.S. So there is kind of a playbook for this, or at least experience with this outside of the U.S., and only now are U.S. investment managers really facing that pressure. But you are right that retail investors, especially younger investors, I think are focusing on this a lot more.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Obviously they can't get access to management and stuff like that with their one proxy vote, but I think in aggregate, there's pressure coming from them as well.
Yeah, and good point on that. I mean, maybe they can't be at go to the Cayman. All those people can't go to the Cayman Islands, and they probably can't stoke a check for, whatever the minimums are. Devin, I want to maybe shift gears a little bit. I know you're at this conference, and you've been doing some interviews and live streaming, and we normally don't talk a lot of technical, but I think the audience would find it interesting. LinkedIn does have this live streaming platform. We've talked about it offline as it relates to the network and possibly doing something on there. But how did that go? And tell us a little bit about that. We've got a couple minutes left in the segment. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a little peek behind the curtain. So it's a pilot product that LinkedIn has offered. And by product, I mean not a paid product, but kind of a tech product that LinkedIn built, called LinkedIn Live. And so right now only a handful, a couple dozen of accounts are testing it before we make it kind of official and roll it out to more people. But yeah, it allows a person's page or a company's page on LinkedIn to broadcast live on the platform. And candidly, other platforms like YouTube and Facebook and Instagram, part of Facebook, have already done this and done this quite well, but we're just allowing people to tap into these big followings they have built on the platform. Many company pages, for example, have built hundreds of thousands or millions of followers, and when they go live on LinkedIn, those followers get notified of it, and so the click-through is quite healthy, and people are drawn to that. So yeah, we started testing it about a year ago at the Milken conference, my colleague Caroline Fairchild and I. And then we've allowed companies and organizations. So Davos this year actually had, I think, something like north of 35 live streams from
Wow.
different companies as well as the World Economic Forum. So definitely something on the tech side to keep an eye on.
And in terms of you doing it, what's it like doing live? I mean, I know you've done live TV before, but what's it like? I mean, you can make mistakes, and I think people are forgiving. But what's it like to, get the cue from the director or the producer and say, okay, we're live, and you're there. You're go, it's go time.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's interesting. I mean, it's fun. It's also tough. I know you've done live TV as well, but actually the live TV I have done previously in my career was normally as a guest, talking
Yeah.
about a story I'd written or some reporting I'd done. So being kind of a host or an anchor or something is a whole different ball game. It requires, as you said, working with producers, countdowns, intros, outros, remembering people's names and titles. I flubbed a few of those this week. And so, yeah, it's quite interesting. It's quite fun. But what I realized actually is guests who come on, and people should keep this in mind when you see people on TV, typically the guests are more nervous. And so a few of the guests who I had on this week kind of, and anytime they admitted that to me or said that to me before the cameras were on, it actually relaxed me, and then I was able to relax them. So
Yeah.
definitely something to remember, that no one is not nervous doing
Yeah,
this kind of stuff.
I think the one thing I've had conversation with people, the anxiety is the one of the things that binds all of us together, because everyone has it.
Yeah.
Well, Devin, it's a pleasure talking with you, and I know we're going to talk with you tomorrow on the network, so look forward to that and hearing your perspective on some top LinkedIn stories. Until then, have a great rest of the conference in beautiful Cayman Islands. We're very jealous, and we will talk to you very soon. Now we're going to shift gears to markets, and joining us on the line from Chicago, Illinois, from the TD Ameritrade Network, Oliver Rennick. Hi, Ollie. How are you?
Yo, what up, Jeff? Doing well.
Yeah, I know you're pulling in 4 hours of programming each and every day, bookending coverage for the TD Ameritrade Network. Lots going on there with coronavirus and job numbers. Let's get your perspective on the week that was.
It was a pretty wild week, mostly of gains. Overall, very solid performance for the S&P 500. We saw stocks climbing, over 100 points as we speak right now. But interesting sort of dynamic as we have kind of facts and evidence about the U.S. economy versus whatever else. And right now that everything else is basically the attempt by the market to sort of gather insight on, and foresight rather, on what the effects of this virus in China are going to be, which is a little bit of a tough game. The response across financial markets was somewhat profound. I would go as far to say over the last 3 weeks, given some of the extremes that we saw in moves like crude oil, which just totally got obliterated and unwound. A whole quarter of gains that were happening as the economic picture on the world was turning better. That was eliminated in like a week and a half. Copper did the same thing. Bonds rallied just really an extraordinary amount, given how strong the U.S. economic picture remains, and actually is almost accelerating in a way over this last 2-week period. Employment situation is really incredible, totally surprising by just about every standard. But there are still, problem points around the world, and coronavirus is just one of them. The other is continuing to figure out just how stable important economies are. The Eurozone data over Thursday night into Friday was very weak, but prior to the coronavirus, they had been doing pretty nicely in terms of turning things around. So it still remains to be seen whether important areas like Germany are accelerating, stabilizing, or declining. It seems like maybe somewhere between stabilizing to, it's hard to know, it's kind of a coin flip. We heard the case from Neil Dutta this morning from Renaissance Macro that we should improve in the euro area. But really right now the focus is on, I think, the sentiment. Questions to be answered still about economic fundamentals out of places like Europe. The market seems to be very quickly in some areas pricing in economic slowdown because of this virus so much. Stocks are near highs. Stocks are moving upwards. Stocks overall are seeing better than expected earnings. They're looking for double-digit 10 to 15% earnings growth this year, but they're still very expensive, which means that you think they would be on thin ice, but they just keep powering higher. And so now we kind of have a choice of, do we believe these other markets like crude, like copper, like bonds, like gold, that are saying there are real problems ahead, or do we believe stocks? And to be honest, stocks had a pretty good track record this past 2 years of having economic insight when asset classes like bonds were a little bit when they didn't need to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, we all know that at some point, and just want to tell the audience, at some point, we're going to have a recession, or at least a downturn, a slight downturn. We don't know exactly the length. I mean, it will come because markets go up, all of our markets go down. Here's a word that we haven't talked about for a while, and I want to just get a real quick take on it. Brexit. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about? Yeah. Has that come up in your shows? On your shows, I should say.
A little bit. For the most part, though, the action in the British pound suggests that big surprise on that front are less likely than they were at any point in the last couple of years. Now it's a question of how much hardball is kind of played as they negotiate a deal, but the British pound has been pretty stable since its big jump in the fall of last year as it became clear that Boris Johnson will be able to get his plan through. So it hasn't accelerated, it hasn't really gained much, and hasn't really dropped much. So I don't think it's as big of an issue for markets anymore. It's one of the geopolitical uncertainties that is moving towards certainty.
And you mentioned coronavirus, and I've been reading a lot about China reacting to that, their markets. I mean, I know you talked to Neil and you've talked to other folks throughout the week. Any thoughts on China's long-term and some of the other emerging markets' long-term prognosis?
Well, outbreaks is lower, and the risk really for coronavirus to be a long-lasting destabilizing force is about its spread and the number of infections. So because it's about the spread, then we consider how viruses spread, and they move exponentially. So that means that any setback or any slowdown in the acceleration rate of infections could potentially be all it takes to signal that the worst is behind us. And what we've seen in the latter part of this week, again, there's a lot of questions about what data do you trust, how do you even record this data, yada, yada.
Right.
And my job is not really to question that. My job is to look at the numbers that are being reported, and right now it does look like the rate of growth of the infections has slowed, which for a virus to spread, that can't happen. So the logic to me looks like the worst, not in terms of the headlines, not in terms of tragic stories, not in terms of any of that stuff, but just the rate of infection growth does seem to suggest that a few more days like this, and we've probably seen the worst.
Yeah, and I second what you're saying about it is a human story rather than a financial market story. Last question, Oliver. We had the State of the Union, and a acquittal by the president. Does that come into play in terms of the markets, what's happening now going forward, or do we just expect status quo going into the elections and that kind of gets factored into the markets?
I think it does. I think, the impeachment stuff never really showed up clearly in the markets in an obvious way, but the possibility of Sanders' nomination or a Warren nomination has to some degree. So I think the chaos in Iowa might have been a reasonable, logical path towards concluding the market views a smaller chance of a Democratic candidate. And President Trump's numbers for probability of winning have been surging this week, according to Predictit. One of our guests, Ben Breitholtz, who does incredible data work, has basically showed that those odds are being driven to a substantial degree by the price of the S&P 500. So given the economic backdrop, given stock market, those things hold consistent, then it pushes probabilities, according to betting markets, towards Trump. Markets generally like stability, and you're putting whatever personal or preferences or anything of that aside. The economy's been good and market has been great since he's been president. It's not, and that doesn't say anything to do with whether or not it's because of him or anybody else. It's just that's the fact. And if you're a market participant, you are probably more inclined to want the status quo to stay in such an environment than to change.
Yeah. Well, people people, Oliver, tend to vote their back pocket. Always good chatting with you, Oliver. People should definitely
Thanks.
check out the 4 hours of coverage and more by Oliver Rennick. And he bookends the TD Ameritrade Network's programming each and every day. Ollie, always a pleasure talking with you. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll talk to you very soon.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, bud. Bye. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk a little real estate with Market Watch's Jacob Passy. Jacob, thanks so much for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure to hear the latest from Jacob Passy as it relates to real estate, personal finance, and so much more. So what's going on, Jacob? Lots of, I've heard things about mortgage rates falling. I've heard, prices dropping for houses. But I know to come to you when I need the right information.
Yeah. So mortgage rates have fallen, indeed. So mortgage rates this past week hit the lowest level since 2016. So that's the lowest level in 3 years, doing the math for everyone.
Wow.
And that's, pretty remarkable. I think, I can't recall if you and I talked about it last week, but this all has to do with the coronavirus. Still, the concerns related to the coronavirus have still, been reflected in markets, been reflected especially in bond markets. Bond rates gone down. And for those who are not familiar with why bond rates go down when more people buy bonds, when the price goes up, when there's more demand. So that kind of people are flying. It's a flight to safety towards bonds rather than the stock market. Although the stock market actually did rebound this week as positive economic data came in, and bond rates also crept upward. But still, the concerns related to the coronavirus have caused mortgage rates to go to 3.45%. Is now the average for the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, according to Freddie Mac. So
wow.
Really low. There's a lot of people who are now eligible for refinancing. There was data out from a company called Black Knight that tracks real estate data. They estimated that I think it was over 11 million mortgage borrowers could save money by refinancing. Now that rates are as low as they are. And so, if you're out there listening and you bought a home in the last year or even refinanced in the last year, you probably could save money by refinancing again.
Wow.
Obviously, there's lots that you have to take into consideration. It's not just the rate. It's also, anytime you refinance a loan, there are probably going to be fees involved. There's, you're extending the length of the loan. So if you, are already 4 years into a 15-year mortgage, you may not want to, that's like, about a quarter of the duration of the mortgage. You don't necessarily want to go back to square one per se. But also, you can add up the savings and, calculate how that would work out for you. And, when you also are adding up the savings, also take into consideration, what will you do with those savings? Are they going to pay down other debts? Are you going to invest them in the market and get a good return that way and compound interest that way in your favor rather than the other way around? So it all adds up. Do the math, but definitely a big deal.
Yeah. So, Jacob, what does that mean for home buying and especially spring home buying? Because I can't believe it. We're into February. Punxsutawney Phil, I think, didn't see a shadow, or she. I don't know if it's a he or she. I think it's a he. And
yeah.
So spring is almost sprung. But what does that mean for spring home buying?
Yeah. Well, depending on who you talk to, spring may have already sprung for the home buying market because of the low rates. So, people are seeing these rock bottom rates and they're looking to take advantage of it. So they're getting, they're looking earlier than they normally would. The reason people tend to buy homes in the spring, I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this before, but it actually really does have a lot to do with the school calendar. Families want to move. If you close on a deal in May, you'll probably move in June or July, and then your kids will be set up for the next school year before it starts. So that's why people tend to look during the spring. Plus, the weather's nice. That if you're walking around doing open houses, that's good. But a lot of it really actually does have to do with the school calendar. But people are setting that aside. There's so much competition. We've talked at length before about the low supply of homes in the market. And so, the low rates are only going to bring more people off the sidelines because it can, help grease the wheels in terms of affordability for someone if they were right on the cusp. Realtor.com and the National Association of Realtors put out a report this week that suggested that this could be the quote-unquote last affordable spring home buying season for quite some time, because they expect that mortgage rates will go up again. And when they do, that's, while that might, cause home prices to slip a little bit, or at least the rate of home price appreciation to decrease a little bit, the fact of the matter remains that there aren't that many homes to go around right now, and that should keep home prices elevated. And so once rates are back up and the supply of homes is still down, that's, the perfect recipe for a fairly unaffordable housing market. So if you are anticipating buying in the next couple of years and you think you might be able to get it done now, it's worth looking into. Obviously, you don't do anything that's not advantageous for you financially, but, keep in mind that rates aren't necessarily going to stay this low forever. So they very well could go up in the next couple of weeks. There's been good news coming out about the coronavirus. There's researchers think that maybe the spread of it has hit a peak, which would be great because it's great when people are healthy. Researchers are closer to determining the source of it, and once they do, that'll help them, in terms of crafting a vaccine and all that good stuff. So, if the coronavirus becomes less of a global concern, that is really what's driving rates right now. And rates would probably go back upward. Probably not necessarily, past 4% or anything like that, but, higher than these, 3-year lows that they're at right now.
Yeah, that's, I guess, more to come on that. Jacob, you also wrote a story this week. The rent is too damn high. And when I saw your article, it made me think of the mayoral race many years ago in New York City, where there was a guy who ran. I don't know if that's where you took the line from, but the rent is
that's like
too damn high party, right?
Basically it's basically a cliche, and I try to not break out that phrase too often, but sometimes it's too good to pass up. So there was a report that came out from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. They're one of the leading, programs researching the housing market nationwide. They put out many reports every year. So they do an annual report looking at the state of the rental market. And what they found is that, the dynamics going on in the rental market are such that a growing number of people are becoming cost burdened, which means that they are spending upwards of a third of their income on housing costs. So, the kind of rule of thumb generally that is espoused by, financial planners, et cetera, is that, you should try to spend no more than a third of your income, your annual income on housing. But for a lot of people, that's just not possible. So there's a few different things going on here. So first off, in the wake of the recession, there's been a growing population of high-income renters. So, historically, people with high incomes, they bought their homes, they owned their own homes. That's not so much the case anymore. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, and many parts of the country, people who make sizable incomes are remaining renters, either for reason of preference or because, as we were just discussing in terms of high home prices, it's really expensive to buy a home. So even if you make 6 figures or above, that might not be enough for you to justify the cost. So, lots of people who are fairly wealthy are renting, and construction companies have responded. Real estate developers have responded. So a lot of the construction of new apartment buildings has focused on this top end of the market, and for folks living in cities like New York, Austin, wherever, you probably have seen this in your own area. You've probably seen the luxury buildings cropping up with, amenities like rooftop pools and gyms and stuff like that. So that's all focusing on the top end of the market. But the flip side of that is that there hasn't been as much building activity at the bottom of the market, at the affordable end of the market. And so as a result, we now see that even people who are middle class are becoming cost burdened if they're renters, and folks who are lower class, who are working class, make around the poverty level, a lot of them are severely cost burdened, meaning they spend over half of their income on housing alone. And think about that. If you're spending 50% of your take-home pay each month on housing, that leaves very little for food, for medicine, for clothes, for other life expenses. So it's a really difficult situation for a lot of folks, and this kind of explains why we've seen rising homelessness rates in many parts of the country.
Yeah, I immediately when you said that, I thought about retirement savings. But you're right. If you're spending more of your income towards housing, leaves you less money left over for paying for the other important things, including retirement.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a big issue, and I can tell you, I live in Jersey City, so I'm right across from the Hudson, waving at you right now, and I can tell you that here in JC, there is a lot of high-end building. And for me and my wife personally, I would just take good security. That's all. That's all I need is prevent people from walking into my apartment, jumping me in the hallways, and I'm a happy camper. I don't need a rooftop pool. Well, I guess more to come on that, Jacob. But always a pleasure talking with you. And I knew you're the man. You're the person to come to when it comes to learning more about real estate. We certainly appreciate your contribution this week, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye. Well, shifting gears, we're going to talk a little retirement, but maybe a little healthcare. Joining us on the line, retirement reporter for MarketWatch, Alessandra Melito. Hi, Ali. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I understand that you I actually saw the piece. You wrote a piece on the coronavirus. A lot going on there. A lot of concern by many Americans as well as people around on the globe. So why don't you give us your perspective?
Yeah, so the coronavirus has obviously been sweeping the headlines lately and causing quite a bit of scare. So I looked at the CDC data and found that of the 12 confirmed cases of coronavirus in the country, at least half of them are of people who are 50 and older. So it actually might be more, but there's one case in particular in Wisconsin where they didn't specify the age, but at least 6 people are in their 50s or 60s. So 6 states have been affected, although there are people under investigation for, I think, 36 states and U.S. territories. And obviously there are like 31,000 cases or more across the globe and 638 deaths around the world. So, it's a big deal. I spoke with a few doctors and professors of infectious diseases who said that the numbers aren't necessarily surprising because older people are more likely to suffer from respiratory illnesses. If you look at the flu stats, a majority of the people who are hospitalized or die from the flu or flu-related sicknesses, they tend to be on the older side, like 65 and older. So it's just something to be acutely aware of. Like, am I saying that you're going to go outside and, contract coronavirus? Probably not, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to get the flu. So you have to be really careful, especially this cold and flu season. I didn't have the flu, but I was at home for like 4 days because I was so sick.
Yeah, this is an important issue. I think there's some lessons here, as you're pointing out. People need to be very careful about getting sick and whether they spread it to their coworkers, right? I think that's number one. And then number two, if you are, you made mention of people that half the cases here in the U.S. are 50, for those 50 and older. I think it's within that population. I mean, you got to take the necessary precautions, get your rest, drink your fluids, go to the doctor, take your flu shot if that makes sense. I don't think you necessarily have to be. It seems like the coronavirus has kind of maybe topped out. At least that's what the data is showing right now, or at least what I'm reading, that maybe the infection is not spreading as exponentially as it was. That's a great sign. But still, lessons to be learned about taking care of yourself, especially for those 50 and older, to make sure that you don't prolong your illness and, Allie, spread that illness. You don't want to spread that illness to other people.
Yeah, definitely. And some of the doctors said that, we're seeing a lot of people running out and buying like those face masks and hand sanitizer. The hand sanitizer is good, although soap and water is better. But as far as the face masks go, a lot of the doctors say that that's not necessarily helpful. You might do a good job of keeping your cold away from other people, which is great, good service for others. But as far as protecting yourself, you're not necessarily going to do that much. A lot of times people don't wear those masks properly, so that's one thing. But also, not all face masks are created the same. Some are much more, sturdier than others, and there's just not a lot of research that shows that they will actually protect you from getting sick. So one doctor, he was like, if people keep buying at such a high consumer demand, you're actually going to be creating a shortage for the people who do need that, which is, doctors and healthcare providers in hospitals.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. And Allie, I often get asked, why on the show and our network do you guys cover healthcare? And I think this is a perfect example why we cover healthcare, because retirement isn't just this nebulous, ambiguous topic, right, Al? I mean, it is healthcare in retirement, which is probably your largest expense, I would imagine. And therefore, taking care of yourself, especially you get to middle age like I am and older, is very important and actually can minimize your expenses down the line in healthcare.
Absolutely. I mean, healthcare is probably the largest expenditure in retirement for people who are in their 60s and older. I figure it's like, $280,000 you could expect to spend in your retirement alone just on healthcare if you're a married couple. So you have to be careful, not only because you will be spending a lot of money, but, if you don't take care of yourself, your retirement will be cut short. You have to be thinking about how to keep yourself safe, how to keep your loved ones safe, and, just staying healthy. Yeah. And a lot of people who are older, they do suffer from a higher risk of respiratory illnesses because they are more chronic illnesses, and chronic illnesses obviously don't help your immune system. And if you're older, your immune system is already weak because as you age, so does your immune system, and it's not as effective, like one doctor said. So yeah, retirement and healthcare definitely go hand in hand.
Yeah, definitely. And so it'll be good to see. Hopefully we have reached this critical point where the infection, they figured out a solution or a vaccine to this virus. They can, tamp it down. I know that there have been many people that were incapacitated or even killed from the virus in China. So hopefully this can dissipate and people can go back to their lives. But I think some real important lessons about why you need to take care of your health at all phases of your life, and especially for those older folks, or more mature folks, as we like to call them. Allie, always a pleasure chatting with you, and look forward to catching up with you again next week on more pertinent issues. Have a great weekend.
Great, you too.
Thanks. Bye. Welcome back. We're going to wrap things up with a look at the latest on Capitol Hill, retirement legislation, and so much more. Joining me on the line, they are the Legal Eagles, David Levine, Kevin Walsh. Both are principals with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, how are you?
We're doing well, Jeff. Thanks for having us on. It's been an exciting week in D.C. and around the country politically. And given all that we've learned from the Iowa caucuses, I think it's a great week to dive right into the policy of the current leaders of the race.
And you know what, Jeff? It's David. I'm not even giving you a shot. I'm diving in here.
Just dive in, David. Just dive in.
Because where are Kevin and I recording this segment? We're in Florida, where all elections come to an end.
David's been busy trying to register to vote earlier today so that his vote counts. Because being in D.C., it doesn't make too much of a difference how he votes.
I'm registering early and registering often, okay?
There you go.
Register early and often. I'll vote early and often.
Okay, that's fine. Why don't you take my ID? That way we can both go to jail. But
on that note, David, please.
I'll visit.
Let's talk about some of the policy differences between some of the candidates.
Sure. Let's talk about this. We could go deep and weedy on this, but I think here is the key thing. What could we see come back out there at this point? Because obviously you've got a whole spectrum here inside the Democrats. You got a Joe Biden who's middle of the road. So it's kind of like coming back to the Obama days, trying to get more universal coverage, maybe more in the Richie Neal type of thing.
Is Joe Biden still in the race?
Joe Biden still is in the race, Kevin. From what I heard, you just declared, and you were the actual winner of the Iowa caucus.
Way to go, Kevin. Way to go.
But at the same time, let's go to Mr. Sanders, Bernie Sanders, on the other end of the political spectrum in the Democratic Party. He's talking about, remember that there's been proposals over the years dating back even, to the Obama years, and there was Bush era proposals. But in the Obama years, there was the talk about capping retirement savings for at certain dollar amounts. I'll call it the anti-Mitt Romney rule, so you can't have the mega IRAs and 401ks. Bernie Sanders is talking about the 401k style cap at this point, and that's out there as well. But then let's flip this over. We got Senator Warren. Senator Warren at this point brings us to two things. First of all, the first thing I'm going to mention is, of course, Senator Warren, and I wouldn't be surprised if other Democrats feel this way. And it also depends on whether the Dems take the Senate or not, which is iffy. I think it leans Republican. Wouldn't you say that, Kevin?
I think it probably leans Republican based on who's up in 2020.
Yeah. So without the Senate taking, if the Democrats were to win everything, maybe they would try to push through the old Obama era fiduciary rule or some new version of it
as legislation
and codify it, which kind of makes it hard to sue over it. But so we might see something like that. But I think something else to keep in mind is missing participants. Kevin's favorite topic. And we're going to talk all about blockchain and missing participants because Senator Warren sponsored a bill on lost and found for missing participants. There's a lot of private industry discussions about blockchain and other things, which we could talk about. We should do blockchain one week, Kevin.
I think we should do it one week, but not this week.
Well, someone move on. So I think that's Senator Warren. but and then Mayor Pete Buttigieg. I always feel like I butcher his name, and I do apologize.
You do. So there's it's Butte Edge Edge. Boot Edge Edge is the T-shirts. They break it out into boot.
It's
the
phonetic.
word edge. The word edge.
But you know what it is? It was just that, Kevin, you were on the ground in Iowa. You clearly know this.
They didn't count me.
I know. Well, because you know what?
They didn't count anybody.
The app failed.
They didn't count anybody.
That's true. That's why we're going to redo it next week after New Hampshire. But Mayor Pete has the idea of potential public option. It's kind of vague, but the public option. Well, this gets into interesting discussions. Look at the spectrum here. There's so much here, and then we've got other key players like Michael Bloomberg. He's been a big city mayor. Don't forget New York City has been talking about having an automatic IRA program. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Mike Bloomberg and of Andrew Yang. Yang said basically trying to get people opting into retirement, trying to get them to save. There's so many different ways.
I think Amy Klobuchar is the last one we really should mention because I feel like talking about Steyer's policies is probably not a good use. You're wasting
time on that one.
and Senator Klobuchar, we should not forget her. She had a good performance in Iowa. Mm-hmm. She, some people think she might come out swing out ahead because she's a true moderate. She might be the Biden replacement if he flames out, and. She's also in favor of mandatory retirement contributions. So what does this all mean? Kevin, tell me what's going to happen. Make your prediction and tell me who's going to win because that's your job.
I think what this means is that, we're at the early stage of a race where retirement policy hasn't been a big focal point, but it's likely to become more important as we get closer to the election day. One thing that President Trump will likely try to run on is the economy. So it's going to be important to watch Democratic proposals with retirement savings and with other economic issues, as Democrats make their case that 4 years is enough.
So at this point, Jeff, I think our takeaway is, who knows? We don't even know who won in Iowa yet. So for heaven's sake, how are we going to know what their policies are going to be? But you can pretty much get a flavor and a feel for this.
Yeah, I think it's too early to predict the future about who the Democrats will nominate when we can't even predict the past about who they caucus selected.
Oh my gosh. Well, guys, that's great. And I think in all seriousness, I'm just hopeful that we can continue to have this conversation and hopefully some of these proposals get into the general discussion, right? I mean, I think as people in the retirement space, this is what we want. We want to hear about these proposals. We want people to discuss it so that retirement is a top issue. I know there are a lot of important issues in the country, but from our perspective, at least I can't speak for you gentlemen, but from my perspective, I think retirement's a very important issue, and we want to keep talking about this. So I thank you guys so much for your time, taking a step away from the conference that you're in, and look forward to talking with you all again next week. Have a great weekend. That wraps up this episode of the BRN Sunday podcast. I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us this week. Our audience continues to grow, and we enjoy bringing you the latest news in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more. I want to thank our contributors as well. They do a great job taking time out of their day to assess the news with us. So until next week, I'm Jeff Snyder. Keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes. And before me, they got a trick. I have to find the contraceptive. You never know, she could be earning or learning.